In DBT, you will often hear about configs and properties, but what's the difference between the two? Why do we define some things in a .sql file using a config macro, but there are some things which are defined in a YAML file? In this video, we are going to clearly understand the difference between a config and properties in DBT. This is a fundamental concept that will help you properly structure, document, and control your DBT product models in production. By the end of this video, you will know what configs are, what properties are, where each one should be defined, and the best practices which are followed in real-world DBT projects. Hi everyone, if you're new here, then welcome, and if you have previously watched my content, then welcome back. We are continuing our DBT series, and if you're finding these videos helpful, then I would encourage you to subscribe to my channel and like and share my videos. Now, without further ado, let's get started. Now, to understand about configs and properties in DBT, let's imagine that we are constructing a house. We are constructing a house. Now, when we are constructing the house, then there are two different types of information that is required. The first is construction information, such as what is the material that needs to be used? Where are we going to build it? What's the place to build it? So such kind of information is going to affect how the house is physically built. This information affects how the house is physically built. And the second type of information is the blueprint information of the house, like the notes that describe the house, like which room is the kitchen, which one is the bedroom. So kitchen, bedroom, what each room is used for. So all of this information is contained in your blueprint. So this is not going to change how the house is built, it just describes the house. It just describes the house. So one information is affecting how the house is built, and the other one is describing the house itself. Similarly, in DBT, configs play the same role as these construction information. They tell DBT how to build your models. How is in DBT is answered by these configs. Like which schema are they going to go in? Will they be created as a table or a view? So how is answered by this config in DBT. And the blueprint for this house can be seen as the properties in DBT. So these describes what the model represents. It can explain each column, because that's what in a model there would be a lot of columns. It describes the rules for each column. It describes the tests that can be applied to each column. So it describes the project, whereas config tells you how the DBT is going to build the project. So that's the main difference between the two. I just want you to remember this analogy throughout this video. Now we have already established that properties are going to define what the model represents, and config is going to describe how DBT builds it. So how and what are important. Now before starting the further discussion, let us understand about different resource types. I will be saying resource types or resources. So what are these? These are nothing. Whatever is in your DBT project, like your models, your seeds, snapshots, we have not discussed these yet, but snapshots, tests, etc. All of these things, these are called as resources in a DBT. If something is telling you what about a resource, then it will be a property. However, if it is telling you how the resource should be built, then it is a config. As simple as this. Always remember this. Now that we have understood what properties and config are, where do we define them? So properties are always defined in .yaml files. Where do we keep these files? Can we just put it anywhere in the DBT project? No. it has to be defined in the resource folder that you are in. So for example, if you have to define property for a model, then it should be in models folder, and then you can name anything to your file. So I'm saying any name .yaml. In this file, you can define properties for the models. If you have to define properties for seeds, then you should go into your seeds folder, and then you can name it anything .yaml. So these are all YAML files. They are in the resource whose property you need to define. So if you need to define model, it is in model. If you need to define properties for seeds, they are in seeds. Similarly, for config, you can describe this in 3 places. First is in your dbt_project.yaml file. You can define config over here. Then second, you can define these config in the .yaml properties file itself. Under config, under config property. So in this file itself, you can have a property called as config, and in that you can define the config. And lastly, you can define this using config macro in .sql file, which means in your models itself. So there are 3 places where you can define config. You can define them in dbt_project.yaml, you can define them in these properties.yaml file, and you can define that in the SQL file itself, like in your model itself. Now these properties, as we are saying, they are describing what? This means that they are describing the metadata about the resource. So if you have to give metadata information, where do you need to put them? In the properties file. They also provide documentation information. So if you have any documentation, that will go in the properties file. If you have to provide data tests, then they will go into your properties file. So what you need, what you add in your properties file: metadata information, documentation information, and describe all the tests related to that particular resource. Now every resource will have its own properties. There are a lot of resources like models, seeds, snapshots, and there will be lots of properties related to each of these resources. We can't go into each of these resources, but let's take an example of model properties. Some properties will be common amongst resources like name, description, etc. But some of the properties would be very specific to the resource type. So for example, model properties. Examples of model properties would be name. This would be the name of the model. Then another property could be description. This would define the description of the model. Then you can write information about the columns under the column property. Then you can also describe the constraints about these columns. You can define your data tests, as I've mentioned earlier, in your properties.yaml file. Then you can define the version of your model in the properties.yaml file. You can also define what is the latest version that you are using. So this metadata information is also can be provided in this file. If you have any deprecation date about this particular model, then also you define that in this properties.yaml file. So there will be a .yaml file in your models folder. That is where you are going to define all of this information. So if you look, this is all a metadata information about your models. That's why we are keeping them in models / whatever name you want to give .yaml files. Now some information like name, description, this can be applied to other resources as well, like name of the seeds, name, description of the seed, name of the snapshot, description of snapshot. So some properties would be common across all resources, but there will be some properties which are particular to that resource type, like the column, constraint information, etc. So you can visit DBT documentation to know about what properties are available for each of the resource types, but the major ones for model have listed them here. So now you can understand that why I have written metadata about the resource here, because this is all metadata information. Documentation, because from these descriptions we can grab the documentation. Data tests, because we can write data tests over here as well. Like over here we are saying we can write data tests. So this is all what you can define in your properties file. So properties.yaml under that resource whose properties you want to define. So we can say that essentially there are 2 types of properties. There are resource specific properties, and there are general properties which applies across all the resources. Similarly, config can also be of different types. First is resource specific config, second is general config, and the third one is warehouse specific config. Now, resource specific, you know that if it is a model, then there will be some properties which are specific to models. If it is a seed, then there would be some properties related to or specific to seeds. So they should be defined here. General config, this config could be applied across all the different resource types. And there are warehouse specific. Now, if you think carefully, when I was telling you about config, it describes how the models should be built in your warehouse. So ultimately there would be some warehouse specific configs as well that you can define. If you're building something in BigQuery, there would be config related to BigQuery. If you're building something using Snowflake as your warehouse, then there could be Snowflake related config. So there are these three types of configs that you can define. Now, I have already mentioned you can define those in three different places: in dbt_project.yaml file, in these properties.yaml file under your resource, and in your .sql files in the config macro. Now let us take examples of each of these types to understand these better. So I'm taking model as my resource again here to explain some of the config related to models. Model specific config could be materialized. How do we want to see this model created in our warehouse? As a table, as incremental, as view? We will discuss about different materializations, but understand that we can define how we want to create this model into our data warehouse. So this is a model specific configuration. Then you can also describe a config called as unique. So this describes a unique column in your model. This will be helpful when you're building snapshots or incremental. So we will understand this better over there. But remember that there is a resource specific config for model which is called as unique that you can define. Then there is another config which is called as freshness in models. So you can define this config as well for model. Similarly, there could be some general properties like database. Where do we want to create this? Which database in our warehouse should we choose for creating any resource? So this is applicable for seed, applicable for models, applicable for snapshots, because there could be different databases in which we want to sync these resources into. So we can define database there. We can define schema. So schema is also available for different resource types. We can define schema for seeds, we can define schema for models like we have done in our previous videos. So you can see that these properties, they are common amongst different resources. You don't have to remember that is this a resource specific config or a general config. I'm just trying to give you information so that you can link things when you're writing your code. Then there are some warehouse specific configurations as well. So in Snowflake, we can create transient tables. Transient tables are those tables which do not hold history. And it's a good thing to create some tables as transient tables so that we don't occupy those storage spaces which the history is going to take when we are building models in our Snowflake. So this configuration is specific to Snowflake. It might not be available in BigQuery, or it might not be available in any other data warehouse. So it is a warehouse specific configuration. And if you remember, when I was showing you the actual SQL statements that our DBT model was executing, it was telling you that create or replace transient table. So that was very Snowflake specific. So there are different types of config, and I've explained you the differences between each one of them. There are others as well, like you can define alias, tags, you can define tags for resources like seeds, snapshots, models, etc. So these are general config. So now you can see that with this information, it's telling you how it needs to be done, how the model needs to be created, how a seed has to be created. But this information is telling you about the what. Now comes one of the most dreaded topics in DBT, which is config inheritance. If you stay with me for a few minutes, I can promise you that you will never forget this topic. So all you need to do is just remember this sentence. Please follow rules, which is P, F and R. So if you remember our discussion about configs, we can describe configs in three places. First is the dbt underscore project dot YAML file. Second is we can go into that particular resource folder and then define any name .yml file. So this is your properties.yml file. And then, so this is like models, and then you define models properties.yml, something like that. And then you can define that in the resource itself. So like a config block in the resource. So like if you went into .sql file, so this is your model, and then you added a config block over here, and then you defined the particular config. So these are the three different places where you can define your config. Now this is your projects folder, right? Because this is your main project file. Then this is your resource folder. This means this is a folder in which you're defining the config. And then this is your resource itself where you're defining it. So this is P, F and R. This is your project. This is your folder in which you're defining the config, and this is the resource itself where you're defining the config. And the order of precedence here is, this is lowest precedence and this one is highest precedence. Now if we go back, now suppose that we want to change the schema. This is a config, yes, from our previous discussion we know this is a config, and the resource for which I want to change schema is a model. Let's suppose that. Let's take an easy example. So we can define that config over here, and I'm saying that here in staging dbt underscore project.yaml, I want the schema to be staging for that model. Then in the resource folder, that is in the models folder, I created this YAML file, and here I'm defining that the model schema should be bronze. And then when I came into this resource itself, so like my .sql file, in the model itself, in the config block, I defined that I want this to be staging underscore bronze. Now out of these three schemas, what do you think my schema would be when this model is run in dbt? Take a pause and then think about it and come back over here and let me know your answer in the comments below. If you have guessed that it would be staging underscore bronze, then this is the right answer. Why? Because of our precedence order, please follow rules. P is for project, F is for folder and R is for resource. So we are defining the same config in resource. It's the same config. We are defining schema in three different places, giving it three different values for the same thing. So whatever is defined in the resource itself, that will take the precedence. Suppose that this was not there. We were only defining the config in these two places. First was in the project file and the second was in the resource folder. Now which one will take precedence? It will be this one, because project.yaml has the least precedence. If there's something above it, then that particular config is chosen. So this is how config inheritance work. All you need to do is just remember this particular line. Please follow rules. P is for project, F is for folder, R is for resource, and you're sorted. Now you can define everything in dbt underscore project.yaml as well, or go into these different places. Let me show you how. Let us first start by creating our properties.yaml file, because we have not done that for our models. We did it for our seeds in the seeds video, but not over here for models. So as I've mentioned previously, you can define your properties.yaml file in the resource folder itself. So like we did it for seeds, we can do it for models. We can do it for snapshots. So we can do similar properties.yaml files. And that will be the properties for that particular resource type. So if you're defining properties.yaml file in seeds folder, then these are the properties applied to the seeds that are applicable. If we define that in models, then that properties.yaml file would be applicable to these models only. In our models, we have 3 layers: bronze, silver and gold. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to define a properties.yaml file for each of these layers individually. I don't want to combine them all. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to go into this bronze folder, create a new file, and I'm going to start with underscore because I want this file to be at the top, and then I'm going to define bronze underscore underscore models.yaml or models underscore properties. You can name it anything. I'm just defining it as bronze underscore underscore models.yaml. Now in this file, the same way you were defining sources and seeds, you have to start with models because these are properties about models. Then we have to define name. This is the property that I'm defining about the model. So I'm defining this as bronze underscore HR underscore data. Then we can give another property, which is description. We have already discussed these properties earlier in the video. So for description, I'm stating that in this model, we are doing the following things. We are renaming the column names. Then we are casting the columns in their right data type and converting the values into standard values. And anyways, this is what we have done till now. So description is there. Then we can define another property which is called as columns. So again, this is metadata. That's why we are defining this in properties.yaml file. Now for columns also we can define the same thing. We can define the name. So name of the column, so first column was age, and then we can define the description of the column. So I can just say this is the age of the employee or any description that you like. Now I will be doing this for all the columns. I don't want to type things in front of you to waste your time. So I'm just going to copy the file that I've already created and paste it over here. So all I have done is I've defined name and description, 2 properties for the models, and then I've defined name and description for columns. So these are all the properties that I have defined. This is just for my bronze HR data. Now I'm going to do the same for my 2 models for silver layer as well. So let's go into our silver layer and I'm going to create a new file. I'll call it underscore silver underscore underscore models.yml, and here I'm going to do the same thing. So let me just copy and paste the stuff here. So you can see again I've defined models, then the name of the model. So this is our clean model first. I'm defining its description and then I'm giving the column names. So you remember we added the lookup values to our education, environment satisfaction, job involvement, all those columns. So I'm defining those columns over here. So education value, this column is the value corresponding to education column from the bronze layer. So I'm defining their descriptions here. And I'm doing the same thing for silver quarantine model as well. There were 2 columns, quarantine reason and quarantined at, that were of importance. So I have defined them over here. So now, till now, I've just defined my properties.yaml file. Now let's come back to our configurations. So first of all, we have defined some config in our dbt_project.yaml file. Why these are config? Because materialized schema. So these things are changing the way DBT is going to build our resources. That's why we are calling these as configs. Now let's forget about these configs for now and only consider that we have this config. So now with this config, what it means is whenever we will be creating our models, they should be created as views and in schema demo. That's it. This is the config that I have defined at the dbt_project.yaml level. Now let us go into our silver layer, let's say. So I am in my _silver __ models.yaml file, and here we have 2 models, right? One is silver clean model and another one is silver quarantine model. So for silver clean model, I'm defining a config over here. So we have to define config as a property. So I'm saying config here, and then I'm just saying materialized as table and schema is silver. That's all I'm saying for this particular model. Similarly, I'm using the same config in my quarantine table as well. So I'm writing config as a property here. I'm saying materialized as table, schema as silver. Now let's just save this. So these configs I have defined at the folder level. Now let's go at the resource level. So I'm going into my clean silver model, and here I'm going to define config at the resource level because I'm in my model, it's a resource itself. So I'm defining it at that. Now here when we have to define config in the .sql file, we have to use Jinja templates, and in Jinja templates we have to define config, and then we say materialized as table, and I'm saying that my schema is silver test. Now I'm writing this as silver test so that I can differentiate it between whether it is choosing this config or the one over here or the one defined in dbt_project.yaml file. So in clean model, I have defined materialized as table and schema should be silver test. Now think carefully and determine what materialization and what schema would be used by all these bronze and silver models. Let's take a look at that. If I have to write things down, then for our bronze, we have please follow rules. Have we defined something for bronze in the project level, like the P level? Yes, we have said that materialization is a view and the schema should be demo. We have not defined it specifically, but if you look at dbt_project.yaml, it is for all the models. So this includes models that are in the bronze layer as well. Have we defined anything at the folder level? No. Have we defined anything at the resource level? No. This means the bronze model, there is only one bronze model for now. It will be created as a view in demo stage schema. Now let us look at our silver layer. Now in silver layer we have two models, clean model and quarantine model. Now let's look at these. Have we defined anything for P, F and R? For clean layer, have we defined anything at project level? Yes, we have. Like I said, in dbt_project.yaml, we have defined materialization as view and schema as demo, and this is applicable for all the models, including silver. So we're going to say yes, we have, and it is a view, and we are saying it is in demo schema. Have we defined anything at the folder level? So yes, we have. In our properties.yaml file, we went ahead and defined materialization as table and schema as silver. So here we have defined materialization as table and schema is silver. Have we defined anything at resource level? This is our clean model. So have we gone into the clean model and defined anything over there? Yes, we have. If we go into our clean model over here, we can see that this is the materialization table and the schema is silver_test. So let's come here and write it as table and the schema is silver_test. Now for this particular one, we have defined config in all three places. And if you remember our rule, please follow rules. We know that the config that will take precedence is R. So silver clean model should be created as a table and it should be created as a table in silver_test schema. Now let's move on to our quarantine model. Again for this P, F and R. So at project level we have it as a view and demo because all our models are defined as views and in demo schema. At folder level, so let's go there. In folder level in models_schema, we can see that we have defined config as materialized as table and schema is silver. So here I'm going to write it as materialization is table at folder level and schema is silver. Have we defined anything at the resource level? So going into our quarantine model, we don't have any code block, config block over here in the resource itself. So we don't have any config over here. So it's nothing. So for our quarantine model, this is the highest config. Please follow rules. So we will be able to see that quarantine model is created as table and in the silver schema. Now let's just verify this. So I'm going to run dbt run command here. So I'm in my terminal and I'm going to do dbt run. So now if you see here, we said bronze will be view in demo schema. So bronze is a view in demo.bronze_hr_data. Silver clean would be table in silver_test. So silver is a table in silver_test. This is clean. And quarantine is a table in silver. So quarantine is a table in silver_hr_data_quarantine. So you see how easy it is using this simple statement, please follow rules, PFR. You can understand which config is going to take precedence. Now there is another thing that I would like to mention. So if you go here in properties.yml file, we defined config as a property here. When we went into our model itself, we define it as a config block. But we can apply the same configuration from dbd_project.yaml itself. So let me just comment this out, save it, and let me remove this config as well from here and the config from here as well. So I've removed all the config and I'm going to apply this same config using dbd_project.yaml. So if we go here, what we can do is, I'm going to say this is our project, right? Now we will go into the bronze layer, and here we can say that whatever is in bronze, we want this to be materialized as a view, and we want this to go into schema bronze. Similarly for silver layer, like we were defining in our properties.yaml file for silver layer, we can say materialized is as table and silver schema. And we were very particular that in silver layer, when we were in the clean model, we wanted to have a different schema and different materialization. So what we can do is, you have to keep the model name same as what you have defined. So I'm going to say silver_hr_data. Silver HR data. So this is our model name, and here we can say that we want to materialize. You have to do plus. Materialize this as, let's say, a view, not a table, and schema should be silver_test. This is what I want to do. So I've applied the config in the same way that I did before. There is some error somewhere. Let's see what it is. Move this here because we were already indented here. So what we did is, inside silver, we are saying that in general, silver should be materialized as a table and schema should be silver. This is the same config that we defined in this silver_models.yaml file. So our properties.yaml file for silver layer. And then when we went into the model and added the config block there, that we have defined over here. So we can do everything in the dbt_project.yaml file itself. And again, our principle is PFR. So this is the config at project level. Then this is the config at folder level. These are the configs at folder level. And this is the config at resource level, because here we are defining a resource and then we are defining config for that resource. So the logic remains same. Instead of going into 10 different places and adding the config over there, what we have done is we have come into our dbt_project.yaml file and have added the config as per the indentation or as per the hierarchy. So both ways are correct. It is up to you which one you want to choose. If this video helped you better understand properties and config and the config inheritance, then hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next skill in the series. Thank you for watching. I will see you in my next one.